Well, hello and welcome to our poster presentation, Pragmatic Humanism in the Health Professions, a guiding framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical practice. My name is Tobias. I will walk you through this poster. These are my colleagues, most of whom are at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, like I am, except our colleague Anna, who is a professional philosopher currently at LMU Munich in Germany. So, we have only a few minutes. Let's delve right in. The issue at hand that we want to talk about today has to do with clinical decision making around matters of DEI and what our philosophical framework has to do with that. Because, as many thinkers have said, including Daniel Dennett, pictured here, whenever we make a decision in a scientific field or an applied science field like the health professions, we're really operating within a philosophical framework, whether we're aware of that or not. And myself and my co-authors happen to believe that it's important to be aware of our guiding framework to make the best possible decisions. And it turns out, when looking at matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that critical theory is really most often the guiding framework for any discussions and decisions around those matters. And we believe there's a problem with that because critical theory, while important, if taken by itself without any other guiding frameworks, has some serious limitations. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we'll offer an alternative framework. We will use standardized testing as our use case, since we assume all our professions have in common that we use standardized tests to an extent and degree, right? I know in my field, speech language pathology, we use it quite a bit. In mental health counseling, it's also used quite a bit. I don't know as much of the other professions, but I'm just going to assume that we all use standardized tests and that they play a role in our clinical practice. And as we know, or should know, as I hope we would know, standardized tests are usually normed on a white middle-class population. That's partly a matter of convenience. Those are the kind of people that are most readily available for things like research studies and validation of tests. There's also an aspect of structural inequities in there, of bias, you name it. All of those things come together and ensure that most of our standardized tests are really reflections of a certain subset of white Americans and not as reflective of anyone else. And there's a sort of a perspective problem with that, right? If we keep construing white middle class culture as the norm, we may well end up thinking that it is somehow better than other cultures, and all our patients, when we restore them to full functioning, should ideally resemble white middle class culture. Right? That's one problem. But there's also the more immediate problem that tests normed on white middle class populations simply do not capture functioning of patients from other populations accurately. And we know that's a big problem in our field, speech language pathology. I'm giving just one reference here of many, Robinson and Norton 2019. Right? So that's a typical problem in our field. I'm just going to assume that similar problems arise in everybody else's field when they use standardized tests. And yet, notice this big and here. This stands for a reality that is just as real, even though it also partially stands in opposition to what I just said. We need standardized tests. Right? Standardized tests are required by insurances, are required by administrators, meaning people who employ clinicians, right? And if you, as a clinician, are able to read standardized tests properly, taking into account when interpreting your results the actual functioning of the patient based on their cultural background, then you still can glean valuable information from these tests, even though they're not normed on the population in question. So we need standardized tests. We cannot really do without them in the world as it is right now, and we can use them appropriately if we take into account variables that were not taken into account when the test in question was developed, right? So that's sort of a contradictory reality, and part of our point today is going to be that really all of reality has contradictory, conflicting aspects that way, and that is going to be an issue in our clinical decision making, and our philosophical framework will play a role in how we deal with these conflicts. Let's take a look at critical theory, which is, like I mentioned, the most prevalent philosophical framework when it comes to DEI matters. But critical theory focuses on one thing and one thing only: power relations. And by that I mean critical theory asks questions like, who has the power in any given space, in any given profession, in any given nation, to shape the discourse and the structures and the systems, and by virtue of that, who is overrepresented in those structures and systems and keeps others out and or down, right? That's the kind of question that critical theory asks, and those are important questions, obviously, right? Why are white middle-class people overrepresented in our standardized tests? Why do we keep using these tests as if that weren't the case, as if we didn't need to account for population differences, and so forth and so forth? That is critical theory. If you ask any such questions, you are using critical theory, and those questions are vital. However, critical theory is frequently used as the only philosophical framework in dealing with DEI matters, and the problem with that is that it very quickly becomes absolutist. By absolutist, I mean it proclaims to have the only truth that matters. And because that is so, critical theory very quickly veers into seeing all of human life as a system of power relations, and into interpreting all those power relations as inherently immoral because they always serve to prop somebody up at the expense of somebody else, right? What gets lost in that process is a whole lot of interpretive nuance. There's no room for complexity. What also gets lost is an ability to work with present circumstances, with things as they are at this moment in time, right? And I'm giving you here an example from my field, a very recent article by Nair et al. That talks about standardized testing exactly like I just presented it to you. Because of this exclusive and absolutist focus, critical theory is not a viable tool, a viable framework to make real-life, real-world clinical decisions around standardized testing. Nair et al. Say both explicitly and implicitly that any participation in those power structures that are enshrined in standardized tests is immoral. They go beyond simply calling that the problem that it is. They call it a moral issue, a moral abomination, if you will, and essentially give us only one choice: either collude with that abomination or commit to dismantling these power structures, which essentially means no longer using any kind of standardized tests. Nair et al. Are not giving us a viable decision-making framework here. Critical theory, because of its singular focus on power structures, simply does not leave any room for real-life maneuvering and working with power structures, even while also attempting to subvert them. Critical theorists like Nair et al. Do not leave us even that choice. So here then is an alternative framework that we would like to present, and we feel it is more complete, more nuanced, richer, and it leaves clinicians with options to act in the real world as it is right here, right now. This framework is called Pragmatic Humanism. It comes out of the long-standing Anglo-American tradition of pragmatism, and our particular take on it is informed by our friend and colleague Anna Honaker, who wrote about this just a few years ago. And as you can see, pragmatic humanism asks more than one set of questions. It has the unique ability to ask different sets of questions and come up with different kinds of answers based on situational necessities. Okay? In the center of our conception is the clinical goals that we come up with in close collaboration with the patient, right? That is evidence-based practice. That should always be at the center of our clinical decision making. The facts that inform our goals, that inform our decision making, are both empirical facts, right? That's the kind of things you find in case histories or standardized tests. It's also historical facts about the relationships between the patient's culture, the patient's population, and the healthcare system or society at large, right? And our own clinical ethics all should inform our clinical goals, but we need more than that to arrive at a clinical goal. We need a philosophical framework. Pragmatism is all about what can be done most usefully in the constraints of the present moment, right? That's the core question of pragmatism. And since it is broad and open-ended and multifaceted, it can incorporate different theoretical frameworks that ask different questions, right? And so I have three here under the broad umbrella of pragmatic humanism. If you look here on the left, I call that existential humanism. This is essentially the line of thinking where we take into account our shared humanity with the patient. This patient is a human being like I myself. We know a thing or two about human functioning, about human needs. What does the patient need from me in this light, in the light of our shared humanity? How can I make sense of the clinical data to arrive at a clinical goal for them? And then here on the right, you see two boxes, and the lower one says critical approaches, right? By critical, we mean the same thing as critical theory. Yes, critical theory does have a place in our clinical decision making, but it needs to be assigned its proper place. It needs to be used as one set of questions that we ask. Questions like, in what ways is our experience, mine and the patient's, so different because of power structures, because of cultural differences, that my sense of a shared humanity runs into its limitations? What do I need to take into account to understand the patient that I don't see yet because of my blind spots, because of my place in societal power structure? So critical approaches do have their place in clinical decision making if we also allow for a sense of shared humanity. And we can do that, we believe, because of what John Inazu calls confident pluralism. That's the idea that in a truly pluralistic, diverse society like the United States, no power structure reaches into every nook and cranny of life. So even if we have to abide by certain power structures at this point, and the patient does too, we live in a pluralistic society where there is room to maneuver and work within existing power structures without doing injustice by ourselves or by the patient. And so all of these approaches come together into making a pragmatic decision. What can I do right here, right now, with this patient that will guide them on their next step forward in the direction that they need to go? And we believe that is a more viable and, at the end of the day, a more just approach to clinical decision making than simply leaving the clinician hanging between the choice of rejecting all existing power structures or colluding with them, as critical theorists would have it. And in the case of standardized testing, a pragmatic approach would be to take standardized test results as they are, as incomplete, superficial snapshots in time of a patient's functioning whose culture may not even match the culture that the standardized test was normed on. And so you've seen this famous painting where Magritte painted a pipe and then wrote underneath it, "This is not a pipe." And what he wanted to showcase, of course, there is that a picture of the pipe is not the same as the real-life object. And standardized tests very much give us something like a picture of this pipe. They're two-dimensional, they're usable only to a certain degree. This picture still tells us something about a pipe, but it's not the same thing as the pipe. And by the same token, our standardized tests are reflections, representations of something in the patient, but we have to make sure we account for all the other variables that matter in interpreting them correctly, including, very notably, cultural variables, variables around diversity, right? So there's a contradiction there. This is not the textbook ways of using these tests, but we can work with that contradiction pragmatically because we know that there's contradictions in all areas of human life, and we can still work with them and around them and through them to make our clinical decisions to the best interest of our patients. I know this was a tour de force, and I wish I could have given you some concrete examples, which was our initial plan when we planned this, but we planned this as a 1-hour session, not as a 10-minute poster, and hence we had to rush you through this. Apologies for that. If you have any remarks, thoughts, comments on this, or just simply questions on what this might look like in real life, reach out to us. I hope this was meaningful to you. Thank you for taking time for engaging with this.